Okay, good evening. Continuing in the book of Exodus, this week's Torah portion is called Mishpatim. So if you remember, last week we read the Torah portion which described the giving of the Torah to the Jews at Mount Sinai. So if you remember, the Jewish people had arrived at Mount Sinai and we had a direct revelation of God to the Jewish people where God spoke to the first two of the Ten Commandments. And that was an incredible experience for the Jewish people, such that the so to speak, the separation that God has put into place so that we can exist in a way that we perceive ourselves to be separate from God and different from God, that separation became less fixed, so that there was more flooding into the world, the light of God. So an analogy that I heard from a teacher friend of mine, Esther Wien, she describes this phenomenon of us existing within the reality of God. And a way to understand that, a parable or metaphor, is like a fetus living inside the womb of its mother. So the fetus is completely ensconced within the womb of the mother, but has no understanding or appreciation of who the mother is, right? So the mother is taking care, giving all the nutrients, all the needs of this baby that's living in utero, and the fetus inside the mother has no perception of who the mother is, doesn't know the mother's even there. And that's a very good metaphor. Like we do try to seek out, like, who is our mother, who is our father, who is God in the world, but we're living within the reality of godliness, of the oneness of God. So what happened at Sinai? Esther Wien describes it as there was a little bit of a thinning of the uterus wall. There was a little bit of a thinning of the mechitza, a little bit of a thinning of that separation between us and God, such that we had an experience of God. Our souls, which are a breath of God, when they had this magnificent revelation of God, that they kind of wanted to return back to the place of the source of where they come from, and so they left our bodies. Our bodies were pushed, it says 12 miles away, and our souls reconnected with godliness. God put everything back together so we could receive the second of the Ten Commandments. And after that, the people said it's too much. This is what we read last week. And then Moses is given the job of going and getting the rest of the Torah so he can bring that down to us, and we can unpack it in a way that we're able to sustain our own existence at the same time. So that's what we learned about last week. We learned about the Ten Commandments, the Aseres Dibros, these overarching principles of Torah law coming through this direct revelation to the Jewish people, and then after the first two, as I said, it came now through Moses, which we're going to learn about more. But it's interesting because the storyline that we read about last week, having this revelation, understanding that Jewish people couldn't do this, and saying to Moses, please go up, get the rest of the Ten Commandments. We can't do this. We can't have this high spiritual, inspirational. We can't live on this plane. It's too intense for us. We can't do this. Go get the rest of the Torah and come back and tell us. And then we have this sort of interruption in the narrative, and we have this week's Torah portion. This week's Torah portion is called Mishpatim. Mishpatim can be translated as ordinances, as laws. They're laws that we probably could come up with on our own. They're social order laws. They're laws about how to live our lives. They're the practical applications of the big picture. We had this huge revelation, this huge inspiration. We had, all the Jewish people uniting as one people with one heart. We talked about this. There was great there was great thunder and lightning, and it was a huge experience. But then it came down into okay, now what does that actually mean? How do we take all these principles and how do we actually live them in our lives? What does it mean for how we exist in the world? And Mishpatim, this week's Torah portion, begins to explain to us, here are the ways that you live out these overarching principles on a daily applications of those big principles. This is the translating the big picture into the everyday life. It's taking all of these huge principles, this huge revelation, and packing it down and holding it in to the ways in which we interact with each other. So this week's Torah portion, we learn about social interaction, social responsibilities, personal injuries, damages, social responsibility, justice, mercy, protection of our property, like the ways in which we interact with each other. What are the laws? How does God want us to live our lives? How are we going to take this huge Torah and live it and be the witnesses for God? How are we going to be the holy people that God wants us to be? And it says in this week's Torah portion that we will be a holy people. It says you are the holy people. You are the firstborn, so to speak, the firstborn of all the nations, meaning you have a special role. The Jewish people have a special role to bring and be the emissaries, the personification. That's the goal, to be the personification of God in this world. How do we act lovingly and with compassion, and how do we know how to live our lives? We look into the Torah. So let me go back a step. And there's a Kabbalistic teaching that even before the physical world was created, before the universe was created, there was the Torah. The Torah was created before anything. And God looked into the Torah to create the world. So that's an interesting kind of way to think about it. So I heard another metaphor for that, another analogy for that, which is that in the old days when you go to the movie theatre, there would be a big reel and there would be a film. And on the film would be a little picture, and it would be one picture after another picture after another picture after another picture. I think most people listening to this will probably remember those days. And light would be shone through the film, and then projected onto the screen would be exactly, that picture that was on the film would be projected onto the screen, and you would see that. And because it was one picture after another, it seemed like everything was flowing, and these were real people and they were doing real things and it was really happening, but you were watching the projection of light passing through the film and being projected onto the screen, right? So that might be a way to understand the Torah is the blueprint for the universe. So God looked into the Torah, so to speak, and reflected through what he saw into the Torah, what he wrote into the Torah, how the Torah was written, projected that such that we could exist. So which is why Abraham could do it in reverse. He could look at the world and understand the Torah. So we learned that he kept some of the mitzvot, he kept some of the Torah before it was even given. How would he know how to keep the Torah? How would Abraham know how to keep the Torah? How would he know he needed to have a circumcision? How would he need to know any of these things? So one of the explanations is because he looked into the world. He had the ability to go the opposite direction. Sometimes we can't do that. We go into the Torah to understand the world, but very insightful, very holy people can look into the world and see the Torah. So just to sort of see that those are linked together. But another major dimension of this conversation has to do with the fact that the Torah and God are linked, are intertwined. God wrote the Torah. So that's an axiom, that's a given for traditional Judaism, that the Torah is the word of God, and in it is packed these big overarching principles that we talked about last week. Like all of that holiness that God wants us, the Jewish people, to be, is packed into the Torah. So how do we unpack it? We learn it. That's one of the things we're doing now. We learn the Torah, and in learning the Torah, we're bringing light into the world. We can't see the light, but it's bringing goodness into the world. It's bringing godliness into the world. And that's one of the roles of the Jewish people, is to bring godliness into the world, to be the ambassador, to be the, what's the word I want to use, witness, that we are the witness for God in the world by living our lives as best as we can, living our lives as connected to godliness, therefore as connected to the Torah as we can, so we can connect ourselves to God and be seen to be, we use this word Baruch Hashem, we spoke about it last week, but it's to be a Kiddush Hashem, to be a people whereby people will look and say, oh, that God, the God of those people who are so just and are so righteous and so are so good, and we should be this way, it should really be this way, and so loving and so compassionate, that the God of these people is the God, right? So we represent God in the world. We're testifying to God in the world. So I just want to fast forward. As I mentioned last week, we had the overarching principles. Now we have the everyday principles, how to unpack into our everyday lives. And one of the things that is discussed in this week's Torah portion is to not be a false witness. In a court of law, we are not to be a false witness. It says, do not spread false reports. Do not, all right, so don't be a false witness. And then it goes on that there's a very severe thing to be a false witness. To give false testimony is a very egregious crime from the Torah standpoint. You think, well, why would it be that way? And I read that one of the reasons why it is so egregious is because we are testifying to godliness in the world. We represent God in the world. So that role of being a witness in the world, if we treat it lightly and we don't hold by it in all of our dealings in the world, then we're undermining who we are as a Jewish people, and that's why it's such an egregious thing. So we who are testifying to God in the world cannot be false witnesses in a court of law. And then it's expounded upon: don't be a gossip bearer. Don't say, don't say things that are not true, that you haven't seen with your own eyes. Don't spread what you hear. Like you might hear something and then tell somebody else, well, I heard it from this person. That's something we mustn't do. That's lashon hara, that's gossiping. And that is not good for the person who is saying it. It's not good for the person who's hearing it. It's altogether not a good thing to be a bearer of gossip, but it's linked in with this don't be a false witness. But I wanted to pull that out, even though it's a bit later in the Torah portion from the beginning, to say that that's one of our roles in the world as Jewish people is to link ourselves to God through the Torah and through how we act and what we do. And a lot of the ordinances are written in this week's Torah portion. So this week's Torah portion begins with the word "and." We learnt that in class when we were, young in grade school, that you never start a sentence with "and." But then when the Torah starts the word with a sentence with the word "and," the "and" is to link you back to the previous section, and the previous section was all about God giving the Torah at Mount Sinai. So He gave the Torah at Mount Sinai, and these are the laws you are to set before them. It says to Moses, and these are laws, right? So yes, I'm going to give you the overarching rules. I'm going to give you all the nitty gritty, all the on the ground, daily ways in which you interact with each other. That's all going to come out through the Torah. So we're not going to divorce our daily lives from our spiritual experiences. Our physical experiences, what we do, what we say, how we act, are linked to the big picture. So nothing becomes mundane. There isn't a mundane action because it's all becomes who we are and how we're connected to the bigger picture. So I remember as a young mother, maybe people are listening who are young mothers, you're doing the laundry and you're cooking for your children and you're doing all these different things. Whatever you're doing, you could feel like this is very mundane and I did it yesterday and I have to do it again today. But what are you doing? You're feeding people and you're clothing people and you're being kind to people and you're teaching people and you're transferring a tradition to people. There's nothing more holy than that, right? It has a purpose, it has a meaning, it has passion, something passionate about what you're doing, because nobody else is going to do that for, maybe they will, but they won't do it as well as you do, hopefully. So anyways, this is something to think about in terms of our daily actions. Our daily actions are not divorced from the Torah. They're all linked in. My husband's a doctor, and he speaks a lot about, his medical care and taking care of people, and some of the questions that come up in terms of how to treat people and what questions come up, and it's all links in. You go ask your rabbi, like, what should I do here, and how do I treat this person, and what does this person need, etc. There's many minute details that link, not just I have to give him this medicine, but in terms of, I can't think of an example off the top of my head. Obviously, end of life issues are big in terms of how to do that in a Torah. And a Torah-infused way. So just leave it at that. But to say that our lives, everyday lives, are infused with connection to a bigger picture, to transcendent ideas. We can have our Mount Sinai's, we can have our inspirational moments, and then we come back down to the daily. But daily has holiness packed in, and when we do the good things and when we do those mitzvot, when we do the things that connect us to God, we're releasing that light into the universe. Just like we're learning Torah, we don't see light, right? But we understand that we're doing something very meaningful. So too, when we do every single mitzvah and we do it with, obviously with more understanding and with more passion and with more desire for connection to God, etc., then it elevates and becomes more and more and more and more light being unpacked from that mitzvah. So here's an analogy that I love, and I use it over and over again, but I think it rings true that if you have a blockage in your system such that you need to go to an acupuncturist, right? So you go to the acupuncturist and they stick a needle in. I don't really know how it works, but it releases the chi so that the whatever flows so that you feel better. But if you put the needle in the wrong place, then the fluids won't flow correctly and you won't be healed, right? You have to put the needle in the correct place. That for sure I know. You have to put the needle in the right place. So similarly, when we do a mitzvah, right? So we can't have a Seder night on what a convenient night for us. It has to be on the Seder night. Like the mitzvah of eating matzah and maror and telling the story has to be done on the correct night, right? That's putting the needle into the acupuncture point. If you light your Shabbat candles on a Tuesday, it's not Shabbat, right? It's not going to unpack that light that's hidden into the mitzvah, to the action of lighting the Shabbat candles, at the correct time on Friday afternoon before the sun goes down, right? That's when you light the Shabbat candles, right? And you could say, well, I feel very spiritual and holy if I, take a drive on Yom Kippur and I don't know, but you get the idea that there are things that this is how you do it in order. This is the mechanism, right? If you want the energy to be unpacked from a mitzvah, you have to do it a certain way. Right, and it might not resonate with you, and it might not be something you want to do, but it's sort of like this is the way it's set up. This is the way God set up the world, just like He set up the natural world with certain laws. There's the law of gravity and electromagnetic laws, etc., It's built into the universe. So too, there are universal laws. Spiritual laws that are packed into the universe, and for us to access them, there are certain things that we can do and certain ways in which we do them that will unpack that for us. And if we don't do it, then it won't. That's just the mechanism. So Judaism, it is considered to be a law-based religion. Right? Yes, we have the spirituality, but we also have the laws. And Mishpatim is the beginning of the expounding upon what these laws are. So God says, these are the laws that you are to set before them. And there's a lot of commentary on what it means to set before people the laws. Set them out like a table, right? If you have people come to your house and you have your food in the refrigerator, right? So it's hard to find, and they don't know what they can have, and they don't know what's for them, and they don't know what tastes good. But if you come in and you have everything spread out on your table, and it's beautifully displayed, and it's lovely colours and lovely tastes and different spices and etc., you get the idea that people are going to really want to eat your food. They're going to see that it looks lovely, and they're going to be very excited about it, and it's going to look like something that they want, and they're going to want it, and so they're going to want to eat it, and they'll take it and they'll eat it, right? So if we want Torah, Judaism, to be something that we want, it says in the Zohar that we should not be like cows chewing on grass, right? Mundane, you're just chewing and it's regurgitating and you're just chewing and it's mindless, and you just kind of, I guess that, I don't know if cows actually are like that, but that's my perception of a cow. I guess that's the Zohar's perception of a cow, that it's just mindless chewing on grass. Don't be like that, right? Set out the table. God says to Moses, don't, set the laws out like a table, like a smorgasbord, and let them choose what works for them, what's good for them, and not that we should do everything, but there are some that we resonate more with. But make it tasty, make it relevant, make it meaningful, make it yours, right? Make it joyous, make it exciting, make it something that you have that you're passionate about. That's what that kind of Judaism that we want to be engaged in. We don't want to be like cows that are just mundanely, or what's the word I'm looking for, just chewing away without any kind of intention to what they're doing. They'll be mindless like a cow chewing on grass. Okay, so the idea of light being packed into the mitzvahs, the goal, the idea of the peeling back of the uterus wall, so we had a perception of God, not being able to live in that kind of reality, having to kind of come back down to earth, so to speak, and now being given the tools by which we can slowly bring more light into the world, not flood the light, not too much at once, but with our daily lives, with our daily actions, we're going to bring light into the world. So how are we going to do that? We're going to do that first. The first ordinances that are laid out for us are the laws of the Jewish slave. So a Jewish slave was somebody who engaged in thievery. He stole, and he doesn't have the money to pay back, so he has to become an indentured servant. He has to work for and live with the person from whom he stole for 6 years. After that 6 years, he's free to leave, right? So it's like the 6 days of work, 7 days you rest, 6 years you work to pay back the money that you stole or whatever you did, and now you're free to go. And there's a lot of laws actually about this slave, that he wasn't like we were Egyptian slaves. He was actually very well taken care of. He was part of the family. He's taken in, teach you how to think, so that you don't come to. So it's a rehabilitation for this person who stole. And if there was only one pillow in the house, the slave would get the pillow. If there's only one bed in the house, the slave would get the bed. So it's not that they were whipped and treated very egregiously like the Jewish people were when we were slaves in Egypt. To be a Hebrew slave wasn't as terrible as that. Obviously, you weren't free to leave. You had to stay there and you had to work, but you were treated very kindly. So at the end of 6 years, you can go free. But there were slaves who wanted to stay. They were sort of living in this environment, and they wanted to stay. So it says in the Torah that if this servant wants to stay, you shall take him to the door or the doorpost, and you will pierce his ear with an awl, and then he will be his servant for life. So there was written into the system a way in which this servant could stay on and continue to be the servant to this master. And he's to pierce his ear on the door frame. So one of the reasons given for that is because these Jewish people heard Mount Sinai. They heard God, revelation. They understood on some level there was God in the world. So we were told by the Ten Commandments, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem your God. You don't have any other gods but me. You should only have one God, right? Don't have another person as your master. Don't have anything as what you idolize, what you chase after. Really, it was a framing of our perception so that we would be lined up with God. So a slave who heard the experience of Mount Sinai and then choose to stay enslaved was something that wasn't so therefore you had to take the ear and put it on there, because that ear who heard it didn't quite internalize it correctly, and even though there was a way for him to maintain his servitude, but it involved the ear that heard. It didn't go in, it didn't become part of you. And I think this is a challenge for all of us. We hear things, we see things, we have experiences, we might have very inspirational moments, but then when it comes down to everyday lives, we've got to keep that passion going. How do we keep that passion going? How do we keep our resolve? How do we not become like cows chewing on our cud and just regurgitating and chewing, without thinking? And how do we not become that slave who wants to stay enslaved and understand, the bigger picture? And actually, it says that the slave that does leave, I can't find it, but it says that if he comes alone, like if he's enslaved as a single man, he is free to go alone. So that's the sentence in the Torah. If he comes alone, he's free to go alone. And I've read that this is expounded out. Like, we come into the world essentially alone. We come into the world alone, and we leave the world alone. However, we do leave the world behind, or we take with us. What do we take with us? Well, obviously we don't take anything physical thing with us, but we take with us our good deeds. We take with us what we've done in this world. We take with us the effects of our light shedding into the world. We're going to use the light metaphor for Torah, right? Torah, right? In the middle of the word Torah is the word or, light. So we, as much as we unpack light by being kind, by being good, by observing the mitzvot, by connecting ourselves to God, by bringing godliness into the world, we're shining light. So that's what we take with us. We leave behind a world that has ripples, that continues to ripple out. I don't know if you've ever had an experience where somebody will say to you, I remember something somebody said to me, 20 years ago, they said it's changed my life. Right, so we don't know. We have no idea what we're putting out into the world, and just keep putting it out there, because it might touch that person or that person or that person, and we're all interconnected. And this week's Torah portion is about the social construct, how we're interconnected with each other, and how important it is to really work on those relationships to make them as holy as possible and make them as loving and compassionate as possible. And then sometimes it's really hard, and we have to kind of fight against our natural inclinations of being annoyed or angry or frustrated or something, to really like hone ourselves and develop good character traits and really be good people all the time. I just watched Mr. Rogers' movie, and he was an amazing person, this Fred Rogers, and how kind he was and thoughtful and respectful of each person's phenomenal. But he wasn't playing that character, that's who he was. So I think one of the themes that plays through all of these ordinances that are laid out for us, that are set before us, as Moses sets before us a table, a smorgasbord of the mitzvahs, is we have different categories. So the first one, as I mentioned, was the laws of the Hebrew slave. And then we have personal injuries. And in this category of personal injuries is the prohibition against hurting your parents. Right? You shall not attack your parents. You can't curse your parents. You can't kidnap people. We have to, if we hurt people, we have to make sure that they're healed. In this category of ordinances is the injunction to be healed, to heal and to be healed. And it comes up again later, but it's if you injure somebody, it's your responsibility to make sure that that person gets healed, and you have to pay for their recovery and pay for their doctor bills and pay for their medicines and pay for them to be healed. So, here we are. We could say, well, it's supposed to be this way. No, we have to do everything we can to take care of things, that damage that we've done in the world, and to try to undo that damage and make it better and make restitution for the things that we've done wrong. So this not attacking your parents and not causing any hurt to your parents is goes through all the Torah. Like, our relationship with our parents is huge, and obviously it's one of the 10 commandments, but it's very difficult to put into action. What does it actually mean when it says honor your parents? What does that mean? And here in this week's Torah portion, we're bringing it down into the reality. What does it mean? It means you can't cause them to bleed. You can't hit them. And actually, if you're a doctor and your parent comes in, or you're a nurse or whatever, and your parent comes in to get some blood taken, you can't be the one to draw blood from your parent, because it says in the Torah that you can't attack your parent. So yes, all right, so it's a nice thing to, you're supposed to treat your parents and be kind to your parents, but you can't be the cause of their bleeding. From this pasuk that says you can't attack your parents and you can't curse your parents, so it tells you what does it actually mean. The next, so again, the thread that's going through is respect for people, is compassion, is kindness. So the slave, if he wants to stay, there's a way to do that. If he wants to go free, he can do that. We're going to be kind to our slave. We're going to give him the pillow. We're going to give him the bed. If I don't have a bed, I'm going to give him my bed. I'm going to give him the possibility to make restitution and to do teshuvah, to return and to be better and to be rehabilitated and go back into the world. I'm going to leave the world, try to leave the world like the slave came in empty-handed and left empty-handed. I'm also going to try to come into the world empty-handed and leave empty-handed, but I'm going to take with me my good deeds, my chesed, my potential, everything that I've rippled out into the world. With the personal injuries category, to heal, to be kind to people, etc. So then the next category is protection of property. And it's couched in, if you have a donkey. So one of the examples of the laws of property includes animals, oxes and donkeys. And it says in this week's Torah portion that if you see your enemy's donkey and your enemy's donkey is weighed down, you have to go and you have to unload the donkey. You have to help the donkey of your enemy, and if it's juxtaposed with the donkey of your friend. So if there's a donkey of your enemy who is loaded up, and there's a donkey of your friend that needs to be loaded, what do you do first? So your natural inclination might be to go to your friend first. You go help your friend, and then you'll get